Welcome to Identity Unboxed, where we provide mentorship and promote representation for Black professionals in the advancement of the Black community.
We are seeking guidance from exceptional Black leaders, scholars, and professionals with expertise in their respective fields.
We hope to foster a space that promotes authenticity, inclusivity, and restoration for our listeners while exploring the intersection of our personal and professional lives.
This project is a culmination of our lived experiences as young Black professionals to transform our life trajectories to overcome adversity and reach triumph.
Our intention is to inspire you on your path to discovering your purpose.
Hello, Dr. Crystal Hall. Thank you so much for being here with us today on Identity Unboxed. You received your PhD in psychology at Princeton University, and you're currently an associate professor at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. And we're super happy to have you here today for this interview. Thank you so much for being here. And I guess we can get started on the very first question. What inspired your interest in pursuing a career involving the intersection between public policy and human psychology?
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So when I started college, I actually started out studying physics. And I had done a lot of math and science throughout high school, and it felt like that was just the path that I was supposed to take. And I dove into a physics major, and early in my second year, just really felt like I didn't see a path of what would be my career. I liked it, and I was very interested in the problem-solving aspect of it in particular, but just really didn't see myself moving forward. And it probably didn't help that I was in a class of, I think maybe 30 or 40, and there were only 2 women in that group. And I started taking classes all over. I was at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. I took classes all over. And one of the classes that I took that I really loved was a class on the psychology of emotion. And that professor at the end of the class actually invited me to work with her in her research lab. And I didn't know anything about doing psychological research, and it was my first exposure to really getting to learn anything about that, and I just loved it. And then that opened up the possibility that that could be a career for me. And so that mentor, and that this was a researcher named Jennifer Lerner. She's now at Harvard in their policy school. She really opened up to me the possibility that that could be what I would do. And I ended up going into psychology for graduate school and really went into that work with this interest in the intersection between psychology and public policy, because that first research project that I worked on as an undergraduate was looking at how emotion influenced people's perceptions of policies and some anti-poverty policies. And so it was really that experience, and having someone say like, hey, this is something that you could do, that you could be good at. And so it was really, I give so much credit to somebody kind of encouraging me to walk through that door, which I don't think I would have found on my own.
That is so amazing. Thank you for taking us back a little bit to the beginning of your professional journey. Would you be able to share a little bit about, you initially were studying physics, and this is something common that's come up with our guests, where they were thinking they were going to go on this path that was usually going to lead to like a lucrative career, and they had this idea about like, this is exactly where I'm going to end up. Could you talk about like your decision-making process when you were like an undergraduate and thinking, oh, I need to do physics for this reason, like, and then that transition time when you decided, okay, I need to move into the psychology?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was just, in high school, being someone who was pretty good at math and science, that's what you were taught to, that would be like the career that was lucrative. That would be the career that would help you, get the type of life that maybe you thought you were supposed to have. And I think also as a young Black woman in those spaces, I was being supported, and that was a positive thing, as like, this is something that you're good at. And it really took just feeling like this just doesn't feel, I wasn't passionate about it. Right. And I always like, I hesitate a little bit because I think we often tell people, go pursue your passions. And I don't know that everybody always feels like they have the ability to do that for a variety of reasons. And so I just hadn't really taken it seriously. And it wasn't until somebody really showed me like, this is another career path and it could be a good career path. And, along the way, I learned that I love teaching, and I learned that, I love so many aspects of that world that I was learning about, what it would mean to be in the academic space. But it was definitely not one of the pathways that was something that I had any exposure to before.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I think that really speaks to the importance of mentorship, especially for young folks that are early on in their career. Part of the reason why we started the podcast was because, we wanted to reach out to older professionals or people that were in their careers so that folks could listen to this and then say, hey, maybe that's something I can do. And so can you speak a little bit more on the importance of having a mentor, or just having that one person that comes into your life and is like, hey, have you thought of this? Because sometimes that's really all it takes, is just one person that you can meet that'll step in and take that role for you.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's having that one person. And ideally, this is why, you need a diversity of on many levels of people, because having someone with shared experience, having someone that looks at you, I think it's so easy to underestimate. I mean, we don't underestimate this, but I think for a lot of people, they don't recognize how powerful that is. And even for me, as an undergraduate, just having a woman be that person was a big deal, because I'd been in this space when I was deep in these physics classes, it was mostly men. And so just having a woman say, and like for me, having an interest in science, having a woman say like, this is also science over here, and a lot of the things that you love about what you're doing apply over here, that was really powerful to me. And I think, I was not somebody who was seeking out mentorship. I was really trying to figure out how to do what I needed to do and how to figure things out on my own, because that's what I thought it meant to be a college student and to be moving into my professional career. And so having someone that really did reach out to me was a big deal. And so that's something that I still think about a lot now in the role of being able to mentor others, is knowing that part of it is we don't always know how to ask for help or when it's okay to ask for help.
You touch on two very important points. Asking for help. That is something that, I think many people in our community struggle with, especially when you're in these spaces and you're solely one of potentially the onlys in the classroom, and can feel that feelings of isolation compound when, you add gender to that and intersectionality. So with you being one of two in your STEM classes, I can't even imagine how you felt so isolated. And I was hoping you'd be able to dive into your time earning your PhD in psychology at Princeton in 2008, and if you'd be able to describe your experience attending a prestigious Ivy League university as a Black woman and the challenges you faced there. It's a big one.
Yes, it's a big one, but I'm so glad that you asked this question, because I feel like my story illustrates so much of what we've already talked about. So I went into Princeton, and the Princeton psychology department, very, very prestigious, one of the strongest psych departments in the country, if not in the world. At the time when I was being recruited there as a graduate student, I think, and I thought about trying to look this up because I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure that it had been maybe a couple decades since the Princeton Psych Department had graduated a Black PhD. But what's really amazing about my experience is I visited Princeton during the traditional weekend where prospective students came, and I met a lot of the students that were looking at the program. And then the group on campus that supported the minority folks, and many of us, of course, were Black. They had a separate weekend where we got to come back and visit again before we made the decision. And it was on those two trips that I met a group of other Black students that were looking at the program. And it was amazing. And when I came back, I remember I shared a hotel room with one of the other Black folks, and we connected, and I ended up and we all were kind of like, well, are you coming? And where else are you looking at? And in the psych department, in my cohort, there were 9 students, and 4 of us were Black that came in. And that was my lifeline. And I was in the social psychology area, and there were 3 of us. There was one Black woman who was a neuroscientist, and then it was me and two other Black folks doing social psychology. And there's still 2 people that I'm still connected with to this day. And we, all 4 of us got through the program, and that was huge. And I think that also speaks to just why creating these opportunities for people to find these connections, that was just enormous for me. And so I felt so fortunate that it worked out, that I was able to move through the program with that group.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. It takes me back to when I was at Evans a year ago, and I remember when we came in, it was the most diverse cohort you guys had accepted. And I just remember feeling that unity with a lot of the Black students that were there. And, through all of the hard courses, we kind of held each other's hands and kept each other in check and helped each other push through it. And so I would love if you could speak more on the importance of those like affinity spaces and having those opportunities to connect, and for universities to build those opportunities for students who are coming into predominantly white institutions who may not have the foundation, or may not even see people that look like them in these spaces typically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important. And I think, it's easy, again, like I said before, it's easy to discount the need for that. But it's so important because that's how I think we all find our, the way to bring our full selves into whatever work that we're doing. And I think it's also so important, I think, just thinking about how we're able to come in and not feel like we're in this position of just representing everything about Blackness, or for anyone, like about like bringing in, like feeling like they have to represent their whole identity or their whole, what they represent to other people. And so I think that's been something that I think about a lot, because, when I was a graduate student and I was in this cohort of 4 Black students, we all had very different ways that we intersected in terms of like what aspects of our identity showed up in our work and how they showed up in our work and the other connections that we made. And so one of the people that I was really close to, she was super involved in like all the Black student government, and she worked a lot with the undergraduates, and I was not nearly as involved in that as she was. And that was just how she, and really that actually tied to what she did further on. One of the other students wasn't involved very much in that at all, and she wasn't as closely tied to us. But I think because the university had just resourced providing support and providing some of those initial connections, I think it gave us all the freedom to do what we needed to do, because, it's not that, every Black student, we all don't need the same things, right? And again, like we know that, but I think it's still can be really shocking how much others don't appreciate that. And, it's the same thing. I think about this when we think about supporting, international students or students that come into the university who don't speak English as a first language. It can be so easy when you don't share that experience to think like, this is what that group needs, right? And it's about, to me, providing resources so that individuals can figure out what they need and find what they need and not feel like they have to fit into the box that we want to put them in. And so I think that's one of the things that really was so just important to me and affirming to me as I went through my experiences, is that I felt like I had the resources to make the connections that I needed to help me get through that. And it, what we need changes over time, but that's something that I've tried hard to remember now that I'm in a position to support those types of infrastructures and systems and things for students.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so glad that you were able to build that community during your time where, there's not a lot of us in these spaces. So that importance of representation is everything. And I think that's so great now that you're able to be that representation for students that you work with. And I was hoping you'd be able to describe a little bit more about how your identity influenced your career study, with specifically going into the intersection of policy and psychology. And if you'd be, willing to kind of dive into that a bit more. And you discussed that some of your other peers that you shared, the same identity with were not as involved in some of the Black issues or different affinity spaces, but I think we all have a different meaning of Blackness. So if you'd be willing to go into that, I think it'd be great.
Yeah, so this is something that I will say it's taken me some time to really find the space that I want to be in here. So I started out, I was really interested in using psychology to understand how we approach anti-poverty efforts. And the way that I was exploring that was really trying to understand, how can psychology help us understand decision making in the context of poverty? When someone's experiencing poverty, how does that influence the way they make decisions? And that's the space that I was in for a long time. And I really actively didn't deeply explore how that intersected with race and racism for a long time. And part of that was, there were many reasons. Part of that was because my mentors were all white and they weren't thinking about race. They weren't asking those questions. And I also just felt like it felt risky to ask those questions and to take those things on. And I think, for a long time, I kind of hid behind, some of the limitations of what it means to do experimental psychology in those spaces. And it's taken me until now, in the last 5 or 6 years, I have been focusing more directly on race, both in some of the teaching that I've done and in the research that I do. And I think the fact that it's taken so long, I think really reflects a lot of the barriers that still exist in the field, and just this idea that it can feel, I won't even say it can feel risky. It can be risky to ask questions that tie closely to your identity, because you run the risk of not being taken as seriously. And, in my field, research that really looks directly at race, it can be harder to publish. It can be harder to get the types of data that you need to ask those questions. And so this has been something that I've been exploring head on in the last several years. Actually, I have a book coming out in the fall that's specifically looking at how the field of applied behavioral science has not directly addressed and acknowledged structural racism in the work that we do. And so it really has felt like a long path to get to a space where I felt like that's something that I could do. And it's easy to blame that on a lot of the barriers that are up in the field. And I also recognize, the fact that I was just unwilling to do it as well. And so that's been something that I'm really excited to get to do now and to get to challenge a lot of the issues that have been there that frankly I've been a part of the problem by not directly addressing them before. And so it's taken me a long time. And I think it's so common, and this is, in the field of public policy, like it's so common that we talk about class when we really should be talking about race, or probably more importantly, we should be talking about the intersection of race and racism and social class. And so it's never too late. And for me as a tenured professor, it has just felt like if not now, like when, like what else am I waiting for, right? And so so that's where the work has evolved to, but it definitely started in a very different place.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I could only imagine, and it's something we still experience today, being a Black person in your field or your place of work that actually wants to speak up about racism and call out certain issues or bring certain issues to light. It can be challenging because this is something we talked about before, people not agreeing, or those with the majority or the power maybe giving you pushback, or viewing you in a certain light, or saying, pulling the race card in a way like, the Black person's going to talk about race, when really it's so personal to us because it impacts us in every way. And so I definitely can understand that pressure that you probably felt throughout your career of like, is this too taboo to speak on? Or should I just stay in my lane, so to say, because that's often what they try to make us do. And I think, going back a little bit to your journey in the behavioral sciences field, we wanted to know if you could describe your experience as a White House Social and Behavioral Sciences Team Fellow, and what advice you have for those on their professional journey who are seeking these types of opportunities.
Yeah, so that was a really surprising opportunity that I had. I, in the fall of 2015, left and spent a year in DC working with the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. And this was a group that was founded, Barack Obama founded this team. And the intent was that this was a group that would work with agencies across the federal government to incorporate insights from applied behavioral science into their work. And I had the opportunity to go and spend a year as a part of that effort. And it was one of the most difficult and also amazing professional experiences I had, because it really allowed me to take everything I'd been studying and a lot of the big tools and insights that seemed most important, and finding ways to directly apply them to real issues. And I've continued to work with that. Part of that team still exists now within the federal government and the General Services Administration. And that work has evolved as well. But I think for me, it was a really amazing opportunity to come in and that I've been talking about often too much in the hypothetical. And I think for me, the biggest lesson and the biggest piece of advice that I would give is, it was not a traditional path to try to pursue something like that. And to me, I really had spent a lot of time questioning whether I wanted to stay in academia, because it did feel like there were so many barriers to doing the type of work that I wanted to do. And I feel really fortunate that I was given that opportunity and that I was able to take that, what felt like a risk, honestly. And so I think for me, the biggest piece of advice that I give is just, you've got to keep your eyes open and make connections, and just be open to the fact that these opportunities can come. But if you're not putting yourself out there, it's harder to find them. And so I think that was something that, I got my job at the University of Washington. I met some faculty as a graduate student at a conference, and I thought about wanting to be in a policy school, but didn't know the way to make that path happen. And it was meeting some folks and following up with them, and then eventually finding an opportunity to apply for this job. And again, this goes back to where we started, where someone invited me in to work in their lab. But as you said, like sometimes that's what it takes. But I think as I move forward in my career, I just began to learn the importance of knowing that that's not always going to come, right? That person is not always going to try to pull you in. And so you've really got to try to step into spaces. And for me, that was being in spaces where people kind of knew me and knew my interests and knew that I was interested in some of these things. And I think if I hadn't done that to the extent that I had over the years, that White House opportunity probably wouldn't have shown up in the way that it did in the time that it did. And so that it's hard, and it's hard finding that balance. And that's something that I struggled with for a long time, is knowing like how much do I stay in my lane and do what I think I'm supposed to do, but still stay open to these other things that often feel a little more exciting, but can sometimes feel risky as well.
That's so great to hear that those relationships that you were building led to you finding those opportunities that are rare. And I think that's a common experience for people in our community, where a lot of times we don't even know what's available out there until someone connects us to those people, or, is in a part of our network. So I think it's so great that you bring up that point that we need to go out and, meet people, go to those conferences, go to networking events, make sure that you're actually involved and active in the community, because that's where you're probably going to find your next opportunity. I know that's true for me. And similarly, I don't want to speak for Brad, but I believe also for Brad, just, having someone that's actually an advocate for you too, in your professional career. And I was hoping, Professor Hall, would you be able to describe like memorable time in your career where someone really did serve as an advocate for you, or kind of the importance of sponsorship in the workplace? I know that's something that is very necessary for BIPOC to be able to advance, and for specifically people in our community to advance. So if you could speak to that, it would be really helpful, I believe.
Yeah, I think I would say two things. I think it's important to have people that understand your identity and your experience, right? People that feel safe and feel like the people that you can go to and be yourself and talk about the hard things. And then there's also the people that are like the genuine allies and mentors. And I think we need both of those. And one of the things that I often tell people is you have to be open to where you look for some of those people. And it's not always about mentorship in terms of someone more senior and someone less senior. And so like one example that I can give is at the University of Washington, I have a group of women that we serve as peer mentors to each other. And we're all women. There's several women of color. We meet regularly. We've done this for over 10 years now. We have lunch and we can all come in, and we're all from different units on campus, and we can talk about, this thing happened to me. What would you do? And they can be like very, very specific issues. And sometimes they're technical things around, I want to consider an extension on this type of grant. What would you do? Sometimes they're very interpersonal things about, my chair or my dean said this thing to me and I don't know how to interpret it. Or I'm trying to make this decision about how to approach this element of my promotion. And that has been such an amazing safe space that I just wouldn't have even recognized how important it would have been, because I thought that, mentorship is about the people that are more senior and have more experience, and finding that in this peer setting has been really, really important. And having women with like a diversity of identity and experience, that has been really, really powerful. And then the other example that I would give, going back to also where we started, was just the importance of having people who are the people that have different types of social power. So I talked about my undergraduate mentor who encouraged me to apply to graduate school, who is somebody who I still talk to and learn from. And so I just had this experience of serving as the first chair, the chair of the first diversity inclusion committee for a professional society that I'm a member of. And it was in many ways a very difficult experience. And this woman who is still a mentor was a member of that committee and was so incredible and really, not only in, a lot of the issues we talked about were issues around underrepresented people of color, but we also had some really important conversations about accessibility, and not just, accessibility for people that are experiencing different types of disabilities, but also thinking about people who are members who are in other countries and trying to access our conference and things like that. But that person, she continues to be such an important mentor. And I think somebody who has supported me, not only in the mentorship that she's provided me, but I know also in the way that she has supported me in the context of kind of lifting me up in front of other people in the field. And so I think when I think about questions like this, I just think about like all the diverse sources of support that I've gotten. And I think it's so important for me to stress to people that aren't Black and that aren't women, to know that they play a role. And it's not just about like, oh, we have to find other Black people to support the Black students. Like, yes, we need to do that. And also other folks need to know that like it's important for you to step up, because there are spaces where having the white person lift up the Black person or just raise the issue, don't make the Black person be the person that has to talk about racism, right? Like finding all these different ways, that's important. And so, yeah, I know I'm going all over the place, but I think just recognizing that all these different sources are so important.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. This is so valuable. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on the topic of networking and putting yourself out there and finding those resources. Just when it comes to the aspect of human emotion and human psychology, those that are a little more socially shy, or those who have anxiety and are kind of afraid to put themselves out there, those that may suffer with imposter syndrome, or feel like I don't even want to pursue this opportunity or go to this event because I'm not even good enough to be in the room, even though that might not be the case. What is your advice to those folks on putting themselves out there?
Yes, I love this question, because this is something that I've struggled with, and I'm very much an introvert. And I think often we think that being an introvert means that you don't like being around people or that you're shy. And it really means that it takes a lot of energy for you to be around people. So I love being around people, but it's being around new people especially can just be very draining. And I'm married to a true extrovert, somebody who gets like energy from being with other people. And I think when you're an introvert, conferences and networking things can be really overwhelming. And my advice is, if you're going to that event or you're going to the conference, and this is something that I did, and I still do this, is if I'm going to an event, I will tell myself, okay, I'm going to have one conversation with somebody that I don't already know. I'm going to try to make one connection, and I want it to be a genuine connection. And I'm going to, talk about myself, and I'm going to ask them, and I'm going to just make one connection. And I think if you approach situations like that without feeling like you have to go and be the biggest social butterfly, but just like make a connection, because over time those add up. And often, you may go in thinking, I want to talk to one people or two people, and maybe you talk to three or four, but those things really add up. Because I think for most of us, our professional circles are pretty small, right? We all fall into niche, and that like slow process of building connections really can add up over time. And so that's my advice to somebody who just feels overwhelmed and feels like, I have a tendency now to go to those settings and I just like gravitate towards the people that I already know. And so being really mindful about, I'm going to have one conversation or two conversations that helps me approach those situations and not feel as overwhelmed.
That is such valuable information. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm an extrovert myself, so I'm just like so interested in hearing other people's perspectives about those events. And I think it's great that you give like some tangibles for people that kind of go into it with the mindset of like, I need to do this one thing and then I'll be able to leave with a connection or a few potential connections. So thank you for that. And then also for talking about that group of women of color. That's amazing that you're able to like bounce ideas off each other and share knowledge and have that psychological safety. I know that's in your field to create that. And just like the value of that is really great. And just pivoting a little bit, in an article that you co-authored in 2021 for the Behavioral Scientist titled Breaking the Silence, Can Behavioral Science Confront Structural Racism? You and Mindy Hernandez state that social scientists have failed to acknowledge that systemic racism and its counterpart, white privilege, are ever-present situational features of American life that often go unacknowledged. Can you speak to this issue in the field and elaborate on how social scientists can improve on acknowledging the influence of racism in societal behaviors? I know that you kind of went into that earlier, but if you want to add to it, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, this was a article that Mindy and I wrote. Mindy is a colleague and very, very dear friend that I've known for almost 20 years. And we have worked together over the years, and we had an experience that really got us thinking about wanting to more deliberately have this conversation in our field. And really, you know, in this, we're really speaking most directly to applied behavioral scientists, applied psychologists, and really just it came out of a point of frustration of why are we not able to talk about race and racism in the work that we do. And we wrote this feeling like we were in this window. We started writing this in the fall of 2020. And at this moment where I think like many of us many folks of color, I think Black folks in particular, feeling like, oh, suddenly the whole world is willing to acknowledge that racism exists, right? And so we were seeing this show up in our own field, and we really wanted to push a little bit more to get the people in our field to really think about how have we been complicit in allowing these patterns of white supremacy to exist, not only in the research that we do, but also just in the norms and the everything about the culture of the field. And so we wrote this feeling like there was a moment where maybe folks were more ready to hear it. And this is what led to the book projects that I mentioned, where we are exploring this in more depth and really giving some guidance to researchers on here's how we can do better. And here's what it would look like to engage in behavioral science that is authentically anti-racist. And it's interesting because we felt like, you know, at the time when we were writing the behavioral scientist piece, we felt a lot of urgency because we were worried that somebody else was going to publish something like this. And like, frankly, we were worried that it was going to be someone white was going to say this. And we really felt like we wanted it to be us. And what's really a little discouraging is that we feel like, if anything, by the time it came out, and even now with this book about to come out later in the fall, is we realize like, oh, we've just like backslid, and it's even more important because we really aren't acknowledging these things. And so I never had any ambition to write a book genuinely, and this felt like a project that had just felt like the right time, and working with Mindy on this felt like the right partner to do this. And so we're really proud of it. And I think, you know, a lot of the things that we've talked about in this conversation today, a lot of these types of stories we talk about in this book. We wrote this book wanting to bring in a lot of our own personal experiences and stories, which was really hard for me as an academic. We are so focused on being objective and talking about the science. And it was really important to us to share our personal experience and like really be upfront with the fact that our personal identity was very much wrapped up in this. And I really give Mindy the credit for that, because Mindy really pushed us and pushed me especially to really like bring these very personal elements to it. And I think it's a much better book because of it. And so I'm really I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to do this with someone who's such a trusted friend and colleague in this work.
That's amazing. I think when it comes to speaking about issues of race and racism and other social issues, a lot of people today, they don't really humanize the issues, because you read about it, you see, even in the issue space, let's say of like homelessness, you see people on the street and it's like, oh, people, it's so easy just to drive by and not really care when it comes to these issues. But when you attach a personal story to it and you see someone that's like, hey, this is me and this is actually what I went through and how I experienced it, it humanizes it in a way that actually allows people to relate to it, or think of a friend that they might have and say, oh, is this what they're talking about? Is this what my friend might have went through? And it allows people to kind of open their mind to that. And so do you think you could elaborate a little more on the importance of sharing those personal narratives and experiences in general when it comes to issues of race and deconstructing white supremacy?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a lot of what you said. Is it makes it more tangible and human to people. And Mindy and I both are so embedded in this field and in the networks of this field, and we really felt like it was important for us to acknowledge that we have been a part of the problem, but then also to show the places where we've also struggled, because I think it's something that's been a challenge for both of us. And one of the people that read an early draft of it is a colleague who is somebody that we both trust very much, which is why we asked him to read it. He's a white man. He is a very successful academic, and we asked him to read it. And one of the things that he said, which really stuck with me, when he wrote back and gave us his comments, he said, I really feel like I know both of you so much more. And that was really powerful to us, because that is part of what we wanted to share, what we want to share with this book is, that we are critiquing this field that we're very much a part of, but that our identities are central to the way we have experienced the problems within the field. And I think for me, I think about this in the classroom, trying to create spaces where people do feel like they can acknowledge how their identity shows up in the way that they are addressing certain problems or understanding problems or putting forth solutions should be okay. And that's something that I think we just often don't do. And I think especially for folks that consider themselves scientists, because we think that science is supposed to be objective, right? And especially for the science of psychology, it's kind of silly when we try to do that, because everything has someone's lens on it. And our argument in that article and in this book is that the lens has been very white. And if we can shift that, it will not only change what we think of as the norms and the insights from the field, but I think more importantly, it will make them more applicable, right? Because when we're trying to address issues in social environments that are steeped in racism and classism, and you can think about it with other things. You can think about it with respect to, misogyny or homophobia, all these things. Like we have to more actively seek those perspectives to understand those problems. So we're talking about this with respect to anti-racism, but I think you can make the same argument for other issues as well. And through all of that, hearing people's stories is so central to being able to do that successfully, in my opinion.
Wow, that is so great. Thank you so much for describing your experience and just touching on the importance of how our identities influence the way that we navigate the world in our careers. And I thought it was particularly interesting that you'd mentioned that you and your colleague that wrote this book were a part of the problem. And I would say that, it could have been the environment that made you feel as if you were part of the problem because objectivity was defined by white people through that white lens that you stated. And maybe we need to redefine what objectivity means in that space and start to incorporate the experiences of, lived experiences of people of color and Black people and be able to really speak to that and be authentic. So, yeah, I think we live like our experiences are subjective. So, that leads into how you are able to observe objectivity in your work. So I just thought that was interesting that you had shared that. And moving forward, just pivoting a little bit more to policy work from your expertise, what role does human psychology play when we see politicians and political parties targeting certain demographics, such as the LGBTQ plus community, as a strategy to galvanize support from voters? I know you talked about at this time you feel that we have reverted since 2020 when it comes to social progress, which I agree with you there. But if you would be able to kind of discuss that from the psychological lens, and then if you have like any recommendations that you would offer for different policies that could create more inclusive spaces for marginalized individuals.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's such a problem that we have the ability to put ourselves in these silos of people who look and think like us, right? And there is this tension between we want to create spaces, obviously, for people to connect with people that look like them. But we know that for, if you are Black or if you are trans, or if you are someone who's a religious minority, like we are most of the time operating in this culture that does not center that perspective, right? And so we learn how to engage in both, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is that part of it is social media, part of it is just how we get information more generally. It makes it so easy to just hear the perspectives that we already agree with. And I think this is a lot of what we're seeing now. And when I think about anti-queer, anti-trans politics right now, there are people that are in these echo chambers of fear, and we have to try to get them out of those, right? Because we know, social psychology teaches us that one of the best ways to disrupt those patterns is exposing people to other perspectives. And it's so much easier for us to not get those perspectives of others, right? Because I can listen to the news or read the news that is what I'm comfortable with. And so that's where I think we have to find more opportunities, is like, how can we get people to not stay in their silo of thoughts and opinions that support them? And like, we're all guilty of this, right? And so this is not something that's unique to one side or the other, because I know for me personally, there are certain news sources that I don't want to listen to, that I don't want to engage with, and there's certain perspectives that I don't want to engage with. But I know that if I were to really listen to someone, I think about this a lot as we're thinking about reproductive health issues. Like, if I really sat down and listened to someone who is, anti-abortion, for example, I'm sure, like, you learn things from hearing, like, what are the values that are underneath people's positions. And I think we don't do enough of that. And I think we would all be better off if we could find ways to do that. But it's hard, and sometimes it's painful. And so it's really tricky to know, how do you create spaces to do that don't create more harm. But I think we do know psychology does teach us that just only listening to the perspectives that we agree with, that's not the way. For sure.
Thank you so much for that. Building off on that, I wanted to get your thoughts on the topic of rhetorical framing and just how a lot of politicians will use rhetorical framings to really drive these narratives in. For example, when we look at, issues on the border, we have presidential figures saying, oh, they're drug dealers, they're rapists, they're bringing crime, and really framing people in a way that incites that fear, even when it comes to policies and legislation relating to the LGBTQ plus community, and, teaching people different ways of life, like, oh, they're trying to indoctrinate your children, and, almost convincing people that if, they learn about certain things, that it's going to influence them to be a certain way, and really driving folks into these silos of fear. Can you speak to more of that as like a tactic and how politicians like play on human psychology to get people sucked into these echo chambers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's allowing people to just use these like mental shortcuts. So in psychology, we talk about this idea of processing information using either this like quick framework, we call it system 1, where you use these mental shortcuts and you're not doing deep processing. And then there's the spectrum, and system 2 is on the other side, where you are deeply processing. And system 1 is very emotional. And I think that the tactics that you're describing are just allowing people to use their system 1, and it allows us to rely on stereotypes and these stigmatized, the feelings that we have about these stigmatized identities without thinking more deeply. And I think when we are throwing these things at people, it's just easier for us as humans to just react based on that feeling, like those feelings of fear. Sometimes it's anger, and they don't encourage us to do the opposite, which is to try to process more deeply and try to understand, because it's harder to do that. And we're all human, and part of being human is, we want to find the shortest path between point A and point B cognitively. And so without encouragement, time, space to really process, we're always going to just jump on those opportunities to reflect based on our emotions. And I think we just have not found the way to often to do that. And, the messages are crafted to capitalize on that. And it's similar, a lot of people with my training are professors in business schools, and they teach consumer behavior. And it's, similar when I'm trying to get you to buy this beverage over that beverage. I'm trying to engage these emotional reactions that will just give you this shortcut of like, oh, this product is good, and so I'm willing to consume it. And I think it's very similar when we think about that in the policy space as well.
That is so fascinating. Thank you for explaining that, and just our thought processes around those decisions that we make kind of subconsciously too. Like you had said, when our emotions are being appealed to, it's easy to kind of just take what you're hearing at face value, and then to not actually probe and analyze where that information's coming from and what the facts are behind it. So I really loved that point that you talked about having like civil discussions with people of opposing perspectives, because I think we all really can learn when we have those productive and engaging conversations about these very, divisive issues oftentimes. So I really appreciate that. And just lastly, one of our favorite questions that we ask all of our guests in conclusion, just on the aspect of identity, what we feel about Blackness and how it's really impacted and influenced our lives, is what does Blackness mean to you?
I love this. I think when I hear that question, the first thing that I think about is resilience. I think that we are just so resilient, and I think about this like as I have three little kids. I have triplets. I have 7-year-old triplets, and we have really loved every year getting to celebrate Juneteenth with them, and every year just kind of reminding them about why we celebrate this. And I think, getting to be in the space of that joy and resilience is so powerful. And it really just reminds me of, on any given day and any given moment with what I'm facing, if I can remind myself of just like the resilience paired with the joy of this community. And I can think back to people in my own family, but just people in the community more broadly. It's so special, and it's such a special thing to be able to raise my kids to really think about, like, this is what it means to be Black, is that we have shown such resilience, and being able to show joy paired with that resilience is such a beautiful thing. And that's something that I hope that my kids will be proud of and continue to just have that be something that can anchor you in whatever work they choose to do. And it anchors me in my own work, is just really being proud of that resilience and the joy that we're able to show in that resilience.
That is absolutely beautiful. And I love hearing that you're able to raise up your kids to feel that Black joy, because oftentimes we don't get to experience that enough. And I know I said that was my last question, but it actually wasn't, because I have another question for you. And just how has like your background in psychology influenced how you're a mother, and how you parent your children? I'm sure like that has a huge impact. So I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's so humbling raising children. And so my path to parenthood is so bizarre, because I became pregnant with triplets with no medical intervention, which is something that was a shock to us. And I didn't know much about multiples. And then to find out that I was carrying triplets was probably the biggest shock of my life. And I think the biggest thing that my children have taught me, and that makes me think about my work, is that, we're all different, right? And so I have 2 boys that are identical, and I have a daughter, and their personalities are so different, and we're raising them in this environment that is, they all have had access to like all the same toys and all the same clothes. And it was really important to us that we were not, for example, trying to gender them and like, okay, the girl does this or plays with this and the boys do that, but to just see how they are all interested in different things has been amazing, because on one level, it helps me feel less worried about, doing the right thing or giving them the right thing, because they're 3 very different people. And to just have this balance of how we try to give them structure, but how we try to give them some freedom, and not taking anything too personally about, how they respond to things, because they all respond so differently. That has been just really, it's really incredible. And those things came up when they were infants, about how they would react differently to things. And it kind of helps us feel like a little less worried about, trying to curate their experience of the world. And so it's very humbling, and just like the most rewarding thing that I get to do, because I mean, speaking of resilient, like children are so resilient. And so that's also really powerful to see.
Yeah, that really warms my heart. I think it's beautiful that you're not trying to mold them into society and, put their identity in a box, but as the parent and as the adult, allow them to find themselves and to just be that guiding force as they grow up and experience life and find themselves, and not, pushing them to be a certain way, but, taking it from that approach of who are you and allowing them to have that self-discovery. And I think that's so beautiful at such a young age, not to try to mold them. And so, do you have anything else to add, or any last questions relating to motherhood, or anything else that we mentioned?
No, I don't think so. I think it just I this has been so fun, and it's so nice to get to reflect on these things, both at the stage I'm at in my career and being a parent, and just thinking about, what I want my kids to see and what I want my kids to how I want them to find their place in the world. And I really, since becoming a parent, one of the things that really, one of the ideas that I come back to a lot is when I think about, I'm in a difficult situation, and I think, how do I want my kids to see what I did in this situation, or how do I want to explain to them what I did? And that has been really powerful. And so when I think a lot about my work, and both the work that my research, but also just how I engage as a leader and as a mentor, that guides me a lot. And I'm just grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you all about this and reflect on all of this. So thank you again for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Hall. This was one of my favorite conversations. Actually, I just found everything so fascinating that you shared about psychology and policy and just your whole experience. So I just really appreciate your time, and we're just so grateful to have you on. We're excited for people to listen into this upcoming in September. So you're one of our first few guests for our second season. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
We are so grateful for your support, and thank you for listening to Identity Unboxed.
Authenticity is your guide to cast an impact on the world that you will be proud of. Signing off with pride, Tiana
and Brad.
Thank you so much.